I want to begin by thanking Professor Harold and Professor McDowell for inviting me and encouraging me to participate in this conference. It is an honor to present with my fellow panelists and to have the opportunity to weigh in on this very pressing issue of race and punishment. The title of my talk is Rethinking the Exceptionality of Guantanamo Bay, Thoughts on Incarceration in the Age of Terror. The questions which have informed this talk were inspired by my unease with the portrayals of torture and other inhumane practices in Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. Popular conceptions of humiliation and brutalization in Abu Ghraib, as well as outrages over practices of torture in Guantanamo, paint a picture of unexplainable lawlessness, antithetical to the American way. Indeed, the images and stories which we are all too familiar with were truly shocking and perhaps even unimaginable. Yet it seems that the exceptionality of these stories belies another story, one which might allow us to comprehend what appears to be incomprehensible. In many ways, this talk is aimed at contributing to this alternative story. It is an exploratory and tentative attempt to help us unsettle Guantanamo's exceptionality so we might better understand its political and discursive implications within the larger context of the American carceral state. Before outlining my version of the story, I want to begin with two anecdotes. In 2006, 3 detainees at Guantanamo committed suicide after participating in hunger strikes and then being force-fed by U.S. personnel. In response to the suicides, the Army commander at Guantanamo said, "They have no regard for life, either ours or their own." I believe this was not an act of desperation, but an act of asymmetrical warfare against us. In the eyes of this commander, it was unfathomable that the detainees might have taken their lives because of the conditions within the prison. According to the authors of the Patriot Act, these detainees had adopted a way of terror and were thus excluded from the community of human beings. From outside of this community, their actions could only be understood as an act of war. 2 years earlier, in 2004, 2 other detainees hung themselves in their cells. These prisoners, however, were not in Guantanamo Bay or in Abu Ghraib. They were being held in the California Youth Authority, and these would not be the first deaths in the CYA. In 1996, 16 deaths were recorded. Between 2000 and 2005, 6 suicides were committed. Speaking of one of the deceased detainees, an officer within the California Division of Juvenile Detention said, "We feel a responsibility, but I don't know that we can be held accountable." In her account, suicides were the result of the inmates' mental disorders, which she said cannot be diagnosed 100% of the time. This officer's reactions, like the Army commanders in Guantanamo, reflects an inability to conceive of the ways in which the brutal experiences of incarceration might force one to commit suicide. The young men who killed themselves in California were thus not acting out of desperation, but were driven by their own mental pathologies. My aim in highlighting these particular cases is not to flatten their juridical, geographical, and institutional differences, nor do I intend to elide the particularities of the detainees' experiences, but rather I want to tease out a vocabulary that would help us think about the links between the domestic prison and the global war prison. To do so, I will use Dylan Rodriguez's concept of the prison regime. As a conceptual and theoretical tool, Rodriguez deploys prison regime to refer to, quote, a modality through which the state organizes, rationalizes, and deploys specific technologies of power, end quote. This concept is particularly useful because, first, it frees the prison up from its domestic landscape, allowing us to conceive of how it operates within diffuse and diverse geographic spaces. Second, it highlights the role of the carceral state, which must be at the center of understanding both domestic prisons and their global counterparts. Third, the emphasis on technologies of power imagines incarceration as a broader set of political and discursive practices beyond the framework of crime and punishment. Cognizant of the racialized bodies which are situated in both domestic and international U.S. prisons, I want to use this talk to call attention to one important practice of the prison regime. This practice is the process of imagining the nation, of drawing the boundaries of belonging in the human and national community. Although the imagining the nation is always ongoing, this particular historical moment appears to have heightened the need to delineate those boundaries. In the borderless world where globalization, where capital, people, and goods are said to flow across seamlessly or formerly rigid borders, the political task of defining who we are appears more urgent now than ever before. In the United States, the September 11 attacks, conducted by 19 men who were all managed to enter the country legally, has made the project of imagining that nation even more pressing. But for those of us who are students of race in America, imagining the American nation has always been a vexed project. As a nation which subscribed to liberal political norms and institutionalized chattel slavery, to think of nation in America is to always reflect on race. From the early days of the Republic, being an American and thus sharing in the liberal social contract was only possible with the status and standing of whiteness. Against the equation of whiteness with national and civic belonging, blackness was always its dark underbelly. To be black was to be within the geographical boundaries of the political community, but to always be excluded from the rights and privileges of belonging. Slavery, as both a practice and a set of ideas, thus haunted the social imaginary of white Americans. It was the foil against which white Americans would make their claims to citizenship. Saidiya Hartman has noted that in these early days of imagining the nation, the captive body was an abstract and empty vessel, vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values. On these bodies, the narratives of disease and danger, discourses of inferiority and otherness were inscribed. Against these bodies, then, the free, white, and male community could stand as fellow humans and citizens in the Revolutionary Republic. We also know that after the Civil War, discourses and practices of exclusion continued to be very important precisely because the war amendments had enshrined ex-slaves with formal inclusion. With the institutionalization of Jim Crow and the resurgent scientific racism of that century, blackness would continue to be the other side of a free white civic community. Another element of imagining the nation in the 19th century was America's growing imperial project, which projected these domestic iterations of race and nation onto the global political landscape. The American frontier became a place where the national imagination was confronted with other racialized bodies, primarily Asian immigrants and Mexicans in the Southwest. Along with westward expansion, the acquisition of Hawaii, the Philippines, Puerto Rico, as well as dominance over Cuba, allowed the United States to claim its seat as an imperial power. Even if the U.S. avoided comparison to European imperialism, the binary of civilized and uncivilized, human and unhuman, which legitimized these conquests, was one shared by empire on both sides of the Atlantic. Like black bodies in the domestic sphere, these newly colonized subjects served as the empty vessels against which a national conception could be enacted. This racial imperial project injected new life into the racist schemas of thought that were already entrenched in the American imaginary. To be an American citizen now relied on the racial bodies of second-class black citizens, but also their colonial counterparts. W.E.B. Du Bois's oft-quoted statement that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line calls our attention to this drawing of exclusionary lines, to the construction of boundaries of belonging, which continue to exclude the non-white from standing in the human and national community. What I've presented is a very truncated picture, narrative of the history of race and nation, but I want to highlight the racial imperial project, which has long been a constitutive but neglected aspect of the nation's self-conception. Following the thesis of Du Bois's essay In the Souls of White Folk, the link between domestic racism and the global practice of empire urges us to consider the internationalization of white supremacy. It is in this legacy of the racial imperial project that we can situate the contemporary carceral state and its prison regime. As the formal and explicit sanctions of exclusion, slavery, Jim Crow, and colonialism receded from view, new technologies of power, including the carceral state, consolidated the task of imagining the nation. As many have pointed out, this link between the decline of the racial state and its carceral counterpart is captured in part by the 13th Amendment. That amendment reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States." The insertion of the exception of punishment is particularly significant in the post-civil rights moment because this carceral state becomes a different, more palpable technology of constructing and excluding non-persons. The contemporary prison regime reinforces and renews the practices of violent exclusion that have always appeared as the other side of an inclusive and American democracy. In the implementation of this constitutional exception, the discourses embodied in the war on drugs, war on crime, and now war on terror enable new avenues through which the boundaries of belonging can be reasserted. Deploying the metaphors of war, which conjure clear images of us versus them, a heightened sense of emergency is generated. Consider, for example, Richard Nixon's discussion of drugs and George Bush's response to September 11th. In a special message to Congress on July 4th, 1969, Nixon constructed drugs as a serious national threat, as a growing menace to the general welfare of the United States. Further, he directed the nation's attention toward penal responses by noting that society has few judgments too severe, few penalties too harsh for the men who make their livelihoods in the narcotics traffic. After the September 11 attacks, Bush responded by declaring a national emergency, calling the attacks a war against all freedom-loving people and an unusual and extraordinary threat to the national security, foreign policy, and economy of the United States. Bush promised to avenge the attacks and remove the threat of terrorism. Evoking states of emergency, both wars operated in national and global geographies, expanding and rejecting the previous legal bounds of what was possible under the framework of crime and punishment. Remember that the war on drugs has had multiple foreign policy implications. Long before the war on terror was launched, the war on drugs had already deployed rendition policy to transport foreign drug dealers to countries that allowed torture. Also, coca eradication policies in Latin America have had punitive and devastating socioeconomic and environmental consequences. Domestically, there's ways in which solitary confinement in supermax penitentiaries parallels the treatments of detainees in the war on terror. These prisoners are often confined for indeterminate periods of time. They are also often denied an extensive review of the reasons for their confinement, raising very serious questions about due process. And while the war on terror is largely understood as an international venture, its implications for citizens and residents within the nation need to be assessed. Under the auspices of Homeland Security, a system of domestic surveillance that feeds off distrust within communities is being reproduced. To elaborate this point, let me just share a short personal anecdote. My family is originally from Ethiopia, and recently my parents' friends had family members come to ask for political asylum. They live outside of DC in a Virginia suburb, and One day, 2 Homeland Security officers knock on the door and say that their neighbors had accused them of keeping illegal aliens in the house. After they discover the 2 asylum seekers, the officers take them away even though they have valid visas. And then they've been since asked to follow their asylum cases from within detention centers where they have limited access to lawyers, family, and other support systems. These kinds of incidents, which are growing, clearly illustrate the drawing of boundaries right in between neighbors. They also remind us of programs such as Neighborhood Watch, which deploy similar methods of citizen-to-citizen surveillance. These overlapping practices and geographies of the war on drugs and war on terror, which I have stated simply here, need to be further detailed because they appear to be facilitating an unprecedented convergence of military, policing, and penal apparatuses. And we all know that although seemingly race-neutral, these wars without a known end, without a clear victory, bring to mind images of particular bodies, raced as black, brown, or Muslim, which can only be legible to the American body politic as threats to its security, as dangers to its hard-earned freedoms. As the nation-state continuously imagines and reimagines what it means to be American, prisons, both global and domestic, become a site where the converse of that identity is inscribed. In this political moment, then, the racialized bodies which are the targets of prison regime function similarly to Saidiya Hartman's account of slavery's captive bodies. Like the enslaved black bodies of a prior era, the incarcerated are empty vessels vulnerable to the projection of others' feelings, ideas, desires, and values. We're running out of time, so let me skip over to the conclusion part. So just moving towards the end, I think unsettling Guantanamo's exceptionality by situating it within the larger apparatus of the American carceral state is critical for several reasons. First, it allows us to begin an examination that can better understand how the penal elements of the war on terror reinforce and redeploy the exclusionary and racial logics of domestic crime and punishment. For example, we can begin to think about how the Crime Bill and Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1966, which expand police power, set the legal and political precedents for the more recent Patriot Act. I also think that such a perspective gives us the possibility of stretching our political imaginations and rethinking the strategies by which we mobilize against prisons. One of the most important aspects of the mid-20th century Black liberation movement was its capacity to constitute its political project in a global framework and forge international networks. Such a strategy needs to be revived if we are to effectively dismantle the prison regime. Returning to the detainees who killed themselves in California and in Guantanamo Bay, we have to re-engage an examination of the links between violence and law. The exceptionality of thesis of Guantanamo contends that the brutality of torture is only possible because this prison lies outside of the law. Thus, the calls for reform have largely focused on bringing the detainees within the law by giving them access to trial by federal courts and thus guaranteeing their legal rights. However, considering the suicides in the California Youth Authority, and also remembering the Department of Justice's elaborate briefs on the legality of torture, complicates the distinction between lawful punishment and lawless torture. Against such neat distinctions, what is striking about the violence of the prison regime is how it blurs the lines of legality and illegality, perpetuating what Michelle Brown calls normal abnormalcy. In this reading, both the California Youth Authority and Guantanamo Bay are normalized spaces constructed through a legal apparatus that reinforces the state's power to punish. Still, despite their stated legality, the violence of these spaces remains abnormal and inhumane. To clarify the meaning of abnormal normalcy or lawful lawlessness, we might reflect on the historical precedent of lynching. In her brilliant work on this topic, Ida B. Wells Barnett elucidates the absurdity of what she calls lynch law. This paradoxical phrase captures for her the contradictions of the inhumane and lawless act of lynching, which is made possible through law and the legal system. Wells Barnett reminds us of the ways in which legal sanction, especially the charge of rape, allows the violence of lynching to be carried out in organized and lawful ways. Similarly, today's prison regime operates at the boundaries of the lawful and lawless. Thus, we have the waterboarding of detainees in Guantanamo, and in the California Youth Authority, incarcerated minors are forcefully injected with antipsychotic medication. So, just last point, I think also that in rejecting the exceptionality of Guantanamo, we can contribute to the growing body of work which has sought to challenge the story of American exceptionalism. This story is a narration of how America's liberal creed has triumphed over the logics of racial exclusion, thus creating a multicultural and even post-racial America. The horrors of Abu Ghraib, the practices of torture in Guantanamo, incite international and domestic outrage because they are juxtaposed against this image of a democratic and egalitarian America. The problem with this is that it masks the historical and contemporary practices of violence and racial exclusion within the domestic arena. To think about the prison industrial complex domestically and its global counterpart as linked requires a sustained and critical reflection on Carl Schmitt's warning that democracy requires first homogeneity, and second, if the need arises, the elimination or eradication of heterogeneity. These words are a sobering reminder of the contradictions of the democratic project in America, which embraces difference, even as it seeks to order and exclude that difference. Thus, we should look at the war on terror and the war on drugs as these moments that elucidate the governing American rule, which is suspended between racial exclusion and democracy. Thank you.